Hello, in this presentation we're going to look at some principles and methods for leadership development. And the idea here is to introduce this to you early in the unit so you can start to take control of the process of growing as a sustainability leader and start to apply some principles and understand some methods that we could use. So these methods and principles are going to end up in your individual leadership development plan that we ask you to build as part of assignment 2 in this unit. So we want to give you an introduction early, and we're also going to go back and get into a bit more detail on this topic in Unit 11. So you can see the learning objectives. We're going to look at some principles that we need to start applying as we're planning and executing some leadership development activities to grow as a leader, some methods that we can use, and we're going to give you some tips on how to use the content of this course to grow as a sustainability leader. So this will help with your leadership development plan, but just keep in mind this is an introduction. We're going to come back to this towards the end of the course in a bit more detail. The rationale here is really to encourage you to take control of the leadership development process. It's particularly important these days as we can't rely on our organisations to do it for us when we're in the workforce. We're so mobile now. Most people change roles every 3 or 4 years on average in Australia at the moment. So it's likely that we'll move around professionally, and therefore we need to manage the long-term process ourselves. So we need to learn some principles and methods to apply in order to do that well. So let's look at some principles of leadership development that we really should apply when we're guiding our own process and indeed helping others, such as mentees or staff that we might have or peers. The first principle I wanted to introduce is this concept from Professor David Day called a leader identity, adopting a leader identity. So this is a critical step in leadership development, and essentially it means adopting a mindset that, hey, when leadership is defined as a process of influence, I am in that space, or I want to be in that space, and therefore I do engage in leadership, and therefore I am a developing leader, and I need to get involved in leadership development activities. And this having this mindset can set up what David Day calls a virtuous cycle, where you start to volunteer to take on some leadership roles, or get a mentor, or get some feedback, and go to a leadership course, and all of a sudden your development really accelerates because you see yourself as leadership development being a relevant topic to you. So I would encourage everybody who's doing this unit to see themselves as a developing leader no matter where they are in their careers. Second principle is the so-called CAS model of leader development. The CAS is an acronym. It stands for Challenge, Assessment and Support. So the idea here is if we're engaging in any form of leadership development activity, we really want to have 3 things happening together. The first is challenge, so we want to stretch ourselves, try some new things. So for example, we might be leading a team. Let's say we're at university and we're doing some group work, which is really a team. We might emerge as a leader in that team, or volunteer to be an assigned leader and engage in some team leadership activities, which we'll learn in this unit. So we're using that as a practice field to learn from experience. And ideally a challenge takes us outside of our comfort zone, gets us trying new things, stretches ourselves a little bit, feel a little bit uncomfortable. That's where we want to be. So that's the first thing we need to find, those practice fields to really challenge ourselves. Second point is assessment or feedback. We need to get some feedback on how we're going. That can be challenging for some people. I'd say most people I work with don't actually enjoy getting feedback. There's a blockage there, a barrier there that they need to work through. So seeing all feedback as a gift, a positive, an opportunity to improve is another mindset element which is really important for leadership development. If you're kind of allergic to getting feedback and would run a mile before asking a colleague for a feedback, that's going to be a problem in leadership development, because as we're trying new things, we really need to get that feedback so we can adjust. So there are different ways of getting feedback. We'll look at that shortly. And then the last step in this model is support. So getting help along the way. It could be a good supervisor, an informal mentor, a coach, a peer, getting help from someone who has more experience. So just in short, we need challenge, feedback and support happening in concert. So as we're building a leadership development plan, for example, a plan that sets out how we're going to grow as a leader, we need to make sure we've got all three of those elements in our plan. That's critical. That's the first thing I'd look for if I was looking at a plan. And all of that happens in context. So in this model here, you'll see it on the right-hand side of the diagram that that process is happening in an organisational context. If you're working, hopefully you're in an organisation surrounded by supportive supervisors and a culture that really values professional development and feedback and experimentation. If so, great, that'll really help you learn. And obviously you need the ability to learn as well, you know, the motivation, the self-discipline, the self-awareness, and just the persistence to keep on going, because not everything you try, of course, will work. There'll be some setbacks along the way. So please remember the CAS model when you're putting together your leadership development plan. We need all three elements of challenge, feedback, and support. Another valuable principle to lock into your memory is this 70-20 rule of leader development. It's widely applied around the world, so anyone who works in leadership development would be aware of this, I'm sure. So what it says is roughly, just a rule of thumb, but roughly 70% of leadership growth happens by doing, by practice. 20% from feedback and support from others, say from a coach, or feedback from peers, a good supervisor, and then 10% from structured training and education. So one of the reasons that we have a leadership development plan requirement in this unit, and as part of assessment 2, is to encourage you to leverage off the course content, which is really in that 10% circle on this diagram, leverage off that, and work out how you're going to find some practice fields to practice some of the tools and techniques that we're going to provide to you in this unit, and get some feedback along the way. So you're working in the 70, the 20, and the 10% reservoirs of growth. It would be irresponsible for us to just design a course that just gives you some knowledge and tools and just leaves it at that, without encouraging you to think about, okay, how am I going to practice these techniques and these strategies, these tools? How am I going to get feedback? And then your leadership development plan is designed to get you thinking about that, and getting you to plan how you're going to do that to get the most out of a unit like this. This is a conceptual model of how people tend to grow in terms of their leadership capacity. And you'll see on the far left of the diagram, you've got people's life experiences, you know, challenges or hardships they might have had, or childhood experiences, and their talents and capacities, their personality, their values, their skills. At the bottom of the diagram, we see their organisational context. Hopefully that's a supportive environment. The culture can help them along, or it can hinder their growth as leaders. And at the top of the diagram, there's some triggers. So going along to a leadership course, or doing a leadership course at university, getting a good mentor, doing a challenging project. These might be triggers that might accelerate some development. And then in the center of the diagram, you'll notice self-awareness is there. So this is critical. It's a prerequisite for leadership development and effective leadership. There's very strong evidence to suggest that more self-aware leaders grow quickly, and they are more effective in the workplace. So we want to build self-awareness as quickly as we can. We typically do that by getting feedback from colleagues as we try new approaches, and reflecting, doing self-assessments. Hopefully this unit will help you to reflect and to work out how you can get more feedback from your colleagues as you try new approaches to leadership. Then towards the right-hand diagram, you'll see that a developing leader builds on that self-awareness to actually self-regulate. That means try new things. So it might be, for example, working around some unhelpful personality traits, or trying to use specific leadership behaviours more frequently in certain contexts. So we're actively managing how we behave, and avoiding some old habits, breaking some old habits, which is not easy. And then on the right hand side of this diagram, we're seeing some results, and hopefully that's positive. We're getting feedback, and that encourages us to continue. So this model might be helpful to you, just to have a think about where you're currently situated in terms of, you know, your organisational context, if you're currently working, where you've been, your background, your life story, how that's shaped you. You've shaped your nature, your values, your skill sets, and the triggers. You know, what's happening in your life right now that might be an opportunity for you to really grow as a leader. Maybe if you're working, maybe you've just been appointed as a team leader for the first time, and it's a great practice field to try a whole range of new leadership tools and strategies. So that would be a great positive trigger to accelerate your leadership development. Another principle is to take personal responsibility. I mentioned this right at the start of this presentation. So it would be a big mistake, as Professor John Adair has stated in this quote that I've put up, to just rely on your organisation to do it all for you. Really need to get into the driver's seat, take control of the process, and apply the principles and methods that we're looking at briefly now. Another concept I've mentioned in this slide is just to think about leadership development really having two dimensions. We can focus on individual leaders, and this unit really does that. So individual growth, but also growth as a team as well. So if, for example, you find yourself in a team leader role where you've got a number of staff reporting to you, you might actually engage in leadership development activities as a group of people to help that group of people to be more effective at exerting influence and driving change. So we can do some work at either the individual or the group level. And just in passing, it's fair to say that one of the criticisms of leadership development over the last few decades is there's probably been too much focus on the individual and not enough on the group. So that's something we need to be aware of. Some other principles are obviously build self-awareness. It came up in the model from Bruce Avolio that we just looked at. So that is fundamental. It's if you've got low levels of self-awareness, there are things we can do. For example, the most common strategy is just to increase the frequency that we get feedback, and we might use some specific tools to do that, like 360-degree feedback, where you get feedback from a variety of people around you as you're working. Reflection is also critical. So we don't learn from experience; we learn by reflecting on experience. So, for example, if you've just had a really challenging leadership experience, perhaps you've tried to lead a project and it was a mixed results, then taking some time to reflect on what you tried to do, what happened, why, what did you learn before moving on to the next project is fundamental. So getting into the habit of reflecting and finding methods that work for you is an important part of leadership development, being a reflective practitioner. Putting a high priority on self-leadership, we've looked at that already in week 1. Knowing yourself, values, knowing your nature, knowing which roles suit you, your strengths and weaknesses, and then actively making good decisions so you can be at your best as a leader. That's self-leadership. So it's a big mistake to skip over doing work in that space. If you do, it'll really come back to haunt you. It'll limit your capacity to influence others, whether you're trying to influence people one-on-one, in a team, or in an organizational or institutional setting. So self-leadership is the foundation for all other forms of leadership development. You need to really focus there. And lastly, use a plan. We're encouraging you to do that in this unit. It doesn't need to be highly complex, but it's really a game plan to say, okay, well, this is what I want to become as a sustainability leader. These are my focus areas where I'm going to do some work, and this is specifically how I'm going to do it. This is how I'm going to get some challenge, some feedback, some support, and reflect. Let's now have a look at some common methods for leadership development. Again, I'm going to move over this pretty quickly because we come back to it in week 11. One low cost and can be highly effective method is to get a mentor. It can be an informal mentor. By that I mean you're not signing up a mentor to work with you monthly for 6 months. You might not even use the M word, but it's a relationship you have with someone that has more experience than you in the area of leadership that you're working on, and you're just tapping into their experience and explaining to them what you're trying to do, and getting their advice, and they'll be asking you some questions and maybe sharing some of their experience that you can learn from. So it's a developmental conversation, and it's usually fairly informal. You know, it can be over coffee, over a lunch, but you're doing some real work. You have some objectives, you have a bit of an agenda. If they ask you to do some reading or some homework, you do it, you take it seriously. So you value their time. You set up the meeting and you have some goals for the meeting. So the first step is to clarify your developmental needs. You know, so for example, if you're working on social networking as a leadership skill, you know, who do I know that's great at networking, that has some time, arrange to meet with them, explain some things you're working on, get some of their advice, go away and practice it, come back, have another discussion. So it's not meant to be a big deal. It can be quite informal, and it can be highly effective. So if you're lucky to get the right mentor at the right time, it can be really transformational in terms of your leadership development. Another common method that again is low cost and high impact, some would argue the most potent form of leadership development, is the so-called challenging job assignments. And all that means is it's a real project that gets you outside of your comfort zone and really getting you trying new things. So you might volunteer to lead a team, for example. Now, keep in mind that there are opportunities everywhere. So if you are at university and you're just starting your career and you've never had a job and you're not working, there's still opportunities. So you'll be doing group work, no doubt, at university. So there's an opportunity to engage in some team leadership. You might volunteer to do some leadership activity outside of work. So to give you an example, a few years ago I was in a club, Toastmasters International, which is a communication and leadership club in my hometown, and a couple of colleagues and myself decided to set up a new club. So it took a bit of work, as you can imagine, setting up a new club. We had to have demonstration meetings, recruit members, charter the club, get it running, and then hand over management to a new executive. So that's just a small example of a challenging job assignment, great practice field for leadership that was just a voluntary activity in the community. So there are lots out there. What's another example? A few years ago I volunteered to run a Clean Up Australia site. So every Clean Up Australia Day they look for volunteers to run a site, and it's your job to coordinate all the activities in that site. So it's not a big deal, but it's a little challenging job assignment, a little leadership project. So have a think about what opportunities you've got to step up and engage in influence, whether it be leading a project team, leading a team, trying to promote a new idea or project or initiative. There's lots of opportunities. Doesn't matter if you're working or not, whether you're senior in an organisation or not, there will be opportunities out there. And the key is to find one that will stretch you in the area you want to grow. So, for example, if you want to work on team leadership, look for an opportunity to lead, say, a project team, or spend some time maybe acting in a team leader role if you're not already there. Another method is to get feedback from colleagues. So this is absolutely critical. We've got to have it. It's not optional. It's an absolutely necessity for leadership development. So the key is to find methods that work and you feel pretty comfortable with. And there's quite a lot of methods. I won't go through them all here. We can explore them later, either in the face-to-face intensives or in week 11. But probably the easiest method is simply identifying a couple of trusted colleagues. They might be students at university or work colleagues that you can explain to them what you're trying to practice, what you're trying to do better. You might even brief them, give them a description of the sort of behaviours you're trying to do more frequently or better. And then after a while, catch up with them one-to-one and say, look, for example, I might be trying to practice active listening as an important leadership skill set, and I might brief a couple of colleagues on what I'm trying to do and give them a one-page summary of the 6 skill sets of active listening, and I ask them just to keep an eye out and ear out to make sure that I'm frequently using those behaviours when appropriate. And then I might catch up with them maybe once a month to just check in and see if they've noticed a difference, whether I'm missing opportunities to engage in active listening or I'm doing a reasonable job. So for most people, that method is pretty easy. You pick people that are not going to be really uncomfortable giving you feedback, and you don't overload them with requests for feedback. So that's just one method. We'll look at some other methods later in this unit, but the key point here is you've got to find some methods to get feedback as you're practicing new approaches that work for you, aren't too uncomfortable, and people give you frank feedback. Let's now look at some tips on building a leadership development plan. Again, we'll expand upon this in week 11, but let's cover the basics now. Firstly, why should we build a plan? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. One is it works. So I work with a lot of people each year, and most programs and courses I have, we have some sort of leadership development plan, and it really helps to take a wide range of tips and theory and tool, which is a large amount, and then filter it or funnel it down to something you can reasonably digest and practice. So I often use an analogy of a a buffet or smorgasbord. Leadership development programs and courses give you all sorts of tips and tools and strategies, and there's no way you can eat it all, no way you can practice it all. So you've got to be very selective about what you pick up and focus on and try to use. And your plate, if you like, as you go along the buffet is your leadership development plan. And you can only put a few things on that plate at any one time. So it forces you to focus on your high priority developmental needs, and therefore use your time more effectively as well. It's also a good communication tool. So if you're working with a good supervisor, a mentor, a peer, or a coach, giving them your plan so they can understand what kind of leader you want to be, your values, your strengths and weaknesses, your developmental objectives, and the actions you're planning to take. They know exactly where you're at, and they should be able to identify where they can help you. So it's a great communication tool when you're getting support from others. It's also an accountability mechanism. If I'm mentoring someone, they've got a plan. We talk about how to do a few things. They go away for a month, they come back and they haven't done anything. They're going to feel really, really awkward. I might start to back away from this relationship. So the pressure's on them to really deliver on their plan. And most people need some of those accountability mechanisms to keep them going. So once you've built a plan, the tip there is really share it with a few people, an informal mentor, a supervisor, a peer, to keep the pressure on you making some progress. Some tips on your plan: make sure it's owned by you. So only put stuff in your plan that you're really going to implement. Don't try to build a big, impressive looking plan that looks good to someone else, but you're really not going to implement it. So take ownership of it. We provide an example plan, a template, in week 11, so you can see what a typical plan looks like. It normally begins with a description of the kind of leader, in this case sustainability leader, you want to be. Usually the first page summarizes your core values, strengths and weaknesses, sometimes your career aspirations as well, as your developmental vision might need to align with your career planning steps or pathway. And then the bulk of the plan is really focusing on your developmental objectives, where you're going to focus. It might be, say, self-leadership, building resilience, or being more influential, being able to exert influence across boundaries without much authority, or team leadership. So where's your focus, your developmental activities? And then finally your actions. How are you going to get challenge, feedback, support, and reflect? How are you going to specifically do that? Most plans focus on both building on strengths as well as addressing weaknesses. It's a bit of a mistake only to address weaknesses. So best practice is doing both. Your strengths are likely to define your career, but also your weaknesses can derail your career. So working on both is a good strategy. Of course, we'd want to implement the CAS principle that we talked about earlier. We want challenge, stretching yourself, trying things new, feedback from colleagues as you go, and support along the way. Good plans also include day-to-day activities that you're trying to use. So it might be things like active listening, or what we call transformational leadership behaviours, like asking good questions to challenge the process, or encouraging the heart type behaviours, acknowledging good work, and celebrating successes. So good plans often have some day-to-day behaviours that people are trying to use more frequently to get into some new habits. So I'd recommend including those in your plan. Getting help from others is also a good tip. I mentioned that before. It's an accountability mechanism to keep you going, but also when you ask people to have a look at your plan, they'll often suggest things to you to help out, resources that might be useful, or other opportunities to stretch yourself or get feedback. Another tip is to keep your plan pretty simple. So I'd recommend no more than 3 developmental objectives, particularly if you're flying solo and you're not within the context of a leadership development program where you have coaches and mentors looking over your shoulder a lot. Three developmental objectives, I think, is about right. And under those 3, you'll have a set of actions. If you find at the end of this unit there's 20 topics you'd like to work on, but you can only work on 3 in your plan, then you can just park the other 17 for now and just nibble away at them in future years. So leadership development is a lifelong process. The earlier you can start, the better. It never really finishes. So, and you don't have to do it all at once when you first put together a plan. I think that's a big mistake to think of that way. So we need to just nibble away at it, get started, focus on high priorities that are most relevant right now. I'd also consider having a project. So I mentioned a few examples that like volunteering to do a Clean Up Australia site, for example, as a little mini leadership project, or volunteering to act in a more senior role at work where you're a team leader. So these may be projects, or you might put your hand up to lead a project at work or in a volunteer organisation. So these projects are valuable because there's a clear start and finish. You might have some developmental objectives going into it. So it might be, say, a team leadership role. You want to practice using some tools on team leadership, get some feedback, get some help along the way, and reflect. So that it's very tangible and a focused way of practicing leadership skills. Alright, so let's just sum up some key points from this presentation. The first point was really take ownership of leadership development. It should start as early as possible. It never finishes. It's an ongoing process throughout your career, but it would be a big mistake to sit back and assume that your organisation is going to do it for you, especially in the 21st century as people are so mobile. In this course, we strongly encourage you to build a leadership development plan as part of assignment 2. We'll help you build that in the second intensive, and we're giving you guidance now and also in Unit 11 to help you build that plan, plus an example plan and a template in Unit 11 to get you started. As you build your plan, keep in mind those 2 concepts: challenge, assessment, support. We need all 3 happening. Stretching yourself, trying new things, getting some feedback along the way, getting support from people who have more experience. And the 70-20-10 rule of leadership says, a course like this really needs to help you tap into learning by doing. So 70% growth happens by practice, by trying new things, 20% from feedback and support from others, 10% from structured learning, like a traditional university course. So we need to start thinking as quickly as we can about how we can take things from this course, start to practice them, get them the feedback, even if we're still a full-time student at university and there'll still be opportunities to practice, or we're in the workplace at a fairly junior level, there'll still be opportunities to try new approaches to leadership, to volunteer, to take on various projects, either at work, at home, in the community, or at university. The opportunities will be there. And lastly, just remember some of those common leadership development methods. They are low-cost, high-impact methods that anyone can use. You don't have to sign up to get an expensive leadership coach. Informal mentoring with someone that has more experience in certain aspects of leadership than yourself. Challenging job assignments, finding little practice fields where you can stretch yourself, take some risks, try some new things, and getting frequent feedback from colleagues along the way so that you can adjust your approach, grow, and hopefully get some positive feedback to encourage you to keep going.